Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. Qohelet, or the Book of Ecclesiastes, is one of the most fascinating, controversial, and conceptually rich books in the Hebrew Bible. Presented as the existential musings of a king in Jerusalem who has lived a long and successful life, this relatively short book has occasioned tremendous controversy in the Jewish world and beyond for its assertions that seem to run contrary to conventional religious beliefs. Yet despite this, Qohelet was canonized and included in the Hebrew Bible and continues to be studied and restudied to this very day, with new perspectives and ideas being teased from the text in every generation. Today, it is our pleasure to speak to a philosopher who has just published a work on Qohelet, which includes new philosophical insights gleaned from many decades of probing and wrestling with this extraordinary biblical book. Our guest today is Dr. Menachem Fisch, who is a Professor Emeritus of the History and Philosophy of Science, as well as the Director of the Center of Religious and Interreligious Studies at Tel Aviv University. His new book, titled Qohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living, which has been beautifully illustrated by the artist Deborah Band, was recently published by Baylor University Press, and I look forward to discussing his intriguing insights with the author today. Professor Fisch, welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas.
Thank you. Thank you, JJ. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So before we dive into your specific reading of the text, I'd like to start by addressing briefly an issue which many readers of the text have to address, which is the authorship and historical context. Traditionally, this book was ascribed to Solomon, King Solomon, living around 1,000 years before the Common Era, and that has been the traditional ascription. However, many in the academic world and beyond have come up with various reasons for believing this is actually a much later book. This is a book likely written in the Persian or Hellenistic period, so perhaps 3 or 4 centuries before the Common Era, and belongs to the Second Temple period in Jewish history. So I want to ask first, what is your stance on the issue, or what does your reading presuppose? And do you think historical context in terms of reading this book philosophically is actually of any importance?
I don't think there's much in my book that casts any light on the mystery, not only of the actual historical authorship of Qohelet, but of the actual historical canonization of the book. We have no idea who wrote it. Even if it is Solomon, we have no idea what Solomon took for granted, who he viewed his adversaries to be, who he was arguing against, and so on and so forth. In terms of language, the philologists tell us that the book has to be pushed up as late as possible. The problem is it's cited by Ben Sira, and we know Ben Sira was authored at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, and therefore we locate Qohelet around there, although its Hebrew here and there is very modern. And, if the philologists could have their way, it would have been pushed up even later. We don't know the context in which the writer composed the book. So mine is an attempt to make religious sense of the text, not to locate who wrote it or who in fact wrote it and who in fact canonized it, but to make religious sense of this text being written in the way it's written, in the order of chapters it has, and to make religious sense of its inclusion, among the other books of the Bible. And both these questions are tough questions. Anyhow, we'll get into them as we proceed.
I'm sure we will. Before we dive in, there's also another point. I mean, this directly relates to your reading, which is that to what degree do you see the Book of Qohelet as a coherent and unitary work? Because obviously for many centuries this was treated as the fruit of one pen, as it were, of one author. But others have claimed that the book does seem to have contradictory ideas in it. It does seem to have different philosophical streams running side by side. So to what degree do you see a fundamental underlying unity in the Book of Qohelet? Or do you buy the idea that there are in fact different worldviews running side by side, even clashing with each other in its pages?
Well, the two options you present are not contradictory. I read it as a unified text presenting a sustainable argument, yet at the same time arguing with positions it disagrees with, and poo-pooing or dismissing without argument other positions it disagrees with. So we do have contrasting voices. But I think in Qohelet, there's a kind of language, Qohelet is written in the first person. The first person sometimes doubled, sometimes tripled. Ra'iti ani belibi. I myself saw or understood in my heart. That's when he's presenting his own views. But when he says yadati, for example, I know that people say this and that, and then he'll articulate a view he doesn't agree with, and then argue against it. So the way in which I read the book, it certainly is a unified whole with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I don't know of any other reading of Qohelet that does that.
Interesting. I'm glad you said that because of the questions that we're about to ask. And so, I mean, I suppose I'd like to dive straight into the center of it, which is that, in your opinion, what are the difficulties that Qohelet's grappling with? He clearly, there's something on his mind, and I'll assume it's a he for the time being, even though it is a feminine feminine title, Qohelet. But what were the problems that he saw that inspired him to declare his worldview, to declare what he declared? What was he grappling with, and how did he seek to answer it?
Okay, let me start by answering a question you haven't asked. And that is, what is the question a reader of Qohelet has to grapple with before being able to say, or in order to be able to say, what Qohelet was grappling with? The big question, of course, is that on the one hand, it's a very, very religious book. Okay? And it's a monotheistic religious book. God is creator of heaven and earth. God holds us accountable. He will judge us. And he's present on every page from verse 12 of the first chapter on. But on the other hand, Qohelet makes no mention whatsoever of divine prophecy, divine revelation, divine covenant, divine command, and nothing about the sacred narrative, the sacred history of Israel presented in the other books of the Bible. There's absolutely no reference to the content of the other 23 books of the Bible. And yet it's a deeply religious, monotheistic book. And of course, whenever it was written, there was only one form of monotheism around. So the first question to ask is to make sense of that grander mission within an obviously religious book. The other sort of difficulties to grapple with is that whatever he's claiming and whatever he's arguing for, by the end of chapter 2, he's standing on the ledge. He's ready to jump. He's despaired of life. He's despaired of his entire life work. He sees no sense in anything. And then moving into chapter 3, the entire mood changes. And he realizes something. And one has to make sense, if one wants to read this as a philosophical deliberation, what happens between the end of 2 and 3. And of course, the very end of the book, Matok ha'or ba'inayim, how sweet is the light of the sun in our eyes, and smach bachor bi'aldutecha, rejoice, young man, in your youth. It ends on a happy note. It ends on a very happy note. And whatever was tormenting Qohelet at the end of chapter 2 begins to be resolved at the beginning of 3 and reaches full resolution at the end. So any reading of Qohelet has to make sense of that to answer the big question of, the monotheism without any monotheistic content, so to speak, and the structure of the moods of the book, from intense question to deep despair to happy realization, and so on and so forth. And the answer now I can begin to answer, the question that you asked. What Qohelet is grappling with is quite clear from the second and the third verse. everything is Hevel, whatever that means. And therefore the question, and this is the question he grapples with, the Hevel premise is not taken back in the course of the book. It runs through it. He doesn't realize that things are not Hevel, whatever that means. And the question to which the book is devoted is what yitaron, what value can our life work under the sun boast, given that everything is Hevel? Okay? Now, understanding what Qohelet was grappling with, first and foremost, demands an account of what Hevel is. And the key to my reading, say the bumper sticker for the reading, is as follows. The vast majority of readers of the book read Hevel to mean meaninglessness, emptiness, futility, vanity, in Michael Fox's case, absurdity, and so on. But then that renders Qohelet's question basically rhetorical. If nothing we can do under the sun makes any sense, if all is meaningless, absurdity, and emptiness, then indeed, what value, worth can our life works boast? And that's a rhetorical question. But if you look at the word Hevel, and I'm not a philologist, but you don't need to be a philologist for this. The work that the Hebrew Bible itself puts the word Hevel to, indeed, it means, like in Aleinu L'Shabeach, Hevel Varik, Hevel and emptiness. It does mean meaninglessness and emptiness, but I'll try to show in the book that this only applies by the Bible to idolatry and idolaters. But when Hevel is applied to human life, for example, Adam Yamav Kahevel Lahevel Dima, okay, that our days are like Hevel. It means something else. It doesn't mean that our lives are empty or futile, but that they are mist-like, they are transient, they are historical. And since Qohelet is not talking merely of the short span of days we are given on the earth, but about our work, our amal, our toil under the sun. I take the word Hevel to connote not merely transience, but time-boundedness. In other words, we are creatures of time. We are creatures of our place and our culture and the contingent circumstances of our birth. And therefore, we are transient in the sense that the values by which we judge, the words by which we plan, the words by which we describe and give an account of the world around us, are transient, time-bound, culture-dependent, historical, Hevel, in that sense of the term. And then his question is not a rhetorical question, but a very, very tough one. And that is, if, given that we are the creatures of history, given that, we can never know for sure what we know for sure, we can never be certain of what we take to be certain. We are always judging contingently according to the norms which we happen to be committed to. But each and every one of us knows that had we been born in a different time and a different place and a different culture, we'd be very, very different people. So giving that time-boundedness of human judgment and rationality, in what sense can we boast our undertakings under the sun to be? That's the way he sets out in the opening verses. And he describes a law-governed, cyclical, natural world, which he is absolutely sure, God hasn't entered the picture, but he's absolutely sure obeys a very fixed, absolute, timeless, cyclical set of rules. Yet the human ear, the human eye, the human mouth cannot contain it. And that discrepancy between the knowledge we can vouch for, between our account of the world we live in, and the ontology, right, the law-governed universe itself, is unbreachable. But then he moves straight into the religious domain and talks about the matter that God has given us to contend with, la'anot bo. And then suddenly the question morphs into a very, very anxious religious question. If God is judging us, if he has given us, and the word given for any Jewish ear, העניין אשר נתן Elohim la'adam la'anot bo, of course, it conjures up both of God's so-called books, the book of scripture, understanding it, and the book of nature. If we're always judging in diverse ways and by means of our contingently committed to norms and standards, how can we ever know that this is what God wants from us? And that's a deep and profound religious question.
It certainly is. As you propose in your reading, Qohelet considers and dismisses some other worldviews. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? Or what potential answers to Qohelet's quandaries does he consider and then dismiss as unacceptable or somehow unsatisfactory in answering his main difficulty?
Well, first of all, he dismisses without argument, he poo-poos two forms of what he calls ksilut, or stupidity. One form accepts his Hevel premise. In other words, that we can never know anything for sure, and because of that, we'll always make mistakes, but it's our duty to do the best as we can. And the first position that he deems to be stupid is a kind of over-religious passivity, saying, since we believe in God, and God will take care of justice, and God will ultimately punish the wicked and reward the righteous, and therefore we'd rather not make mistakes and make things work, and therefore not take responsibility for the world at all. And at most, and beginning of chapter 5, that kind of position morphs into an over-religious position where people tend to go to the temple and make sacrifices and make promises, and by performing rituals on the vertical, fool themselves into thinking that they're doing their religious duty. Well, for Qohelet, to do your religious duty is to take responsibility for your world and do the best you can to make it better. Although better is relative and is a Hevel concept, but that's what we have to work with. So that's one position he rejects quite angrily, actually, claiming that if that's your position, then motar ha'adam min ha'beima ayin, then there's no difference between man and beast, because you are not using your rationality. The other position he dismisses are the uber-wise, who poo-poo the very notion of Hevel and confuse their feeling of certainty with certainty themselves. And therefore, and he has absolutely no patience with them either. So positions he dismisses from various points of view. One position is the very familiar position that accepts his Hevel premise and accepts the question of ma yitaron, what is the worth of our labor, but they measure worth in material terms. So they give the terms value, worth, and so on and so forth a material meaning. And since that's measurable, and we could have a discussion about game theoretic accounts of rationality, the kind of measure rationality according to the way in which you maximize your utility function. in the kind of marketplace logic. This Qohelet is dead against, because material worth, first of all, it's a retrospective measure. What about people working and yet not succeeding yet? Are they rational? Are they doing their duty? The criterion of worth has to be prospective, according to Qohelet. The other thing is, of course, you can be doing your best and yet not succeeding because of external factors you've no control of. So again, he has a whole set of arguments against that position. And then the one position he takes very, very seriously, so seriously, in fact, that most readers of Qohelet claim that this is his position because he gives it such a good case, and that is the position of, let me call it, benign hedonism. And that is chapter 9, where the hedonist says to Qohelet, listen, we accept your Hevel premise, we accept, the question you ask, but we're not willing to accept your answer, because the answer, the wise, responsible religious person is someone who's always self-questioning, opening himself up to the criticism of others, always doubtful, always focusing on doomsday scenarios and so on and so forth. And this isn't a life for them. And if that's the deal you're giving us, let's make the most of our brief respite on earth and enjoy ourselves. And he paints that enjoyment not the way most religious thinkers dismiss hedonism as kind of wild and unruly and immoral and so on and so forth. No, live with the wife that you love, with food and drink on the table and oil on your head for some reason, shemen al roshcha lo yachsar, and so on and so forth. And he makes the case for hedonism very, very convincing in order to effectively shoot it down. And the thing about hedonism is that there's a difference, Qohelet argues in chapter 9, between being able to predict catastrophe, which we can never do, and being prepared for catastrophe, which is a different thing entirely. If you imagine sort of catastrophic situations, what will happen if someone will attack us? What will happen in the case of an earthquake? What will happen in the case of natural disaster or human hazard? And you can prepare for that to an extent, even to a great extent. And the Qohelet wise person will be doing that. Okay, but hedonist societies will not have place for such party poopers, critical, grim, always thinking, in terms of dark scenarios. And it's a beautiful passage, and where he says, and then when we're attacked by a king from the outside, there's this wise person who's capable of saving the city, but nobody listens to him. He has no standing. He has no voice. And that's his argument against hedonism. I really think chapter 9 is a brilliant chapter. These are the main positions he either dismisses or argues against, while at the same time developing his own position.
I suppose it is significant that, as you mentioned, in his dismissal of hedonism for precisely that reason, which is that Qohelet speaks as a king. The sort of the persona he adopts is that of someone as Melech B'Yerushalayim. And I suppose that if it is, I suppose, instructive that he dismisses hedonism in your reading based on a kind of a political outlook that foresees potential disaster and realizes that a state or a polity full of hedonists cannot possibly defend themselves, or cannot possibly, at least in his reading, take out the time and the mental space to from the eating, from the drinking, from enjoying themselves, in order to perhaps take preventative measures to stave off disaster. And I suppose that fits in with his persona.
Yeah, I don't know if it's right to characterize him as thinking as a king throughout, It's obvious to Qohelet, and he has another position which he dismisses, very briefly describes and dismisses, and that is a person who, because different people have different conceptions of the good, and people will be at each other's throats, and this sort of critical disputation that goes on all the time, they'd rather live alone. They'd rather live alone and do good at the top of a mountain. Now, Qohelet dismisses that because his very notion of tikkun olam, his very notion of doing good, involves society. It's doing good within the context of human society. Therefore, at the beginning of chapter 4, he has to deal with the political problem of how we can vouch for a stable social setting, political setting, in which different people have different conceptions of the good, to the extent that in their eagerness to do good, they'll be at each other's throats. Now, this isn't a Hobbesian kind of dark picture of human animal nature, of our brute nature. No, it's about people doing good with very, very different ideas of good. And his answer to that is that we need each other because two are better than one and three are better than two when it comes to keeping warm, when it comes to the basic necessities to fight off enemies and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of Popperian argument in this sense, that a pluralistic society, a diverse society, can be stable because we recognize our need for each other, about the basic hunger, pain, defense, and so on and so forth. And that will ensure, according to Qohelet, a society in which we can criticize each other and benefit from criticism. In fact, by the time he gets to chapter 7, diversity becomes a real asset. Because that's the only way you can create critical distance from what you think is right, is by being exposed to the critique of others who think differently. So yes, to go back to your question, he argues within a political setting, but I think that by the time he's done with the great King Solomon in the first half of chapter 2, he doesn't assume that kind of monarchical point of view, but rather the point of view of a political philosopher, someone who conducts his philosophical deliberations within a sort of political context. And indeed, his grand dismissal of the two forms of foolishness in chapter 8 is by means of a sort of grand Aristophanean ridicule of a city run by these two types of fools, those who are cocksure of themselves and those who sit passively doing nothing. And that's the background for the beginning of 11, where his very, very wise, humble farmer is introduced as. But that is not in a political situation. This is about individual rationality. So yes, there is that political context, but I wouldn't read it as from the point of view of the king.
Interesting. So something in what you said caught my attention, because you said that Qohelet, let's say, lionizes the position of a society that can accept diverse points of view, or society that can accept a criticism, and specifically the individual that can accept criticism. And would you say this is part of his solution to the Hevel problem? Because the Hevel problem assumes that every person is tied to their point and their moment, and is in danger of simply expressing, as it were, or clinging to the orthodoxies of their day, which are necessarily transient. But I suppose a society in which numerous points of view are heard and considered judiciously is a society which at least you have some possibility of escaping the narrow boundaries of the worldview that would otherwise capture you. I mean, is that part of a possible solution to the problem of being trapped in one moment in history?
Yeah, well, according to the reading I propose, it's a major part of the solution, But you have to understand what the solution is. We haven't really talked about that yet.
In which case, without further delay, I think it behooves us, now that we've spent a long time talking about the problem, talk about the solution. What does Qohelet propose as the way around this?
Yeah. Well, the first grand realization is the beginning of chapter 3. The famous for everything there is a season, right? And I think that Pete Seeger got it. I mean, his turn. He puts this to an upbeat tune and really captures the sort of happy note of that chapter. And if you look at it closely, and I do so in the book, he goes back to the verses that befuddled him in chapter 1 about Ra'iti et Ainyan. I now understand the thing that God has given us to contend with. And in chapter 1, he calls it an inyan ra, an evil, a bad matter. Here, it's not called a bad matter anymore. The inyan ra evaporates from the verse. And he says, now I understand the task God has given us. And what I think he understands is the following, that lakol zman, it's not for everything there is a season. According to my reading, everything under the sun is created in time. Everything is hevel. Everything is transient and time-bound. And what he realizes is that God knows this as creator of the world and creator of us. He knows that we cannot breach that glass ceiling of the temporality of our and the time-boundedness of our judgment. And therefore, lakol zman, and therefore et lekol chefetz tachat hashamayim, and therefore every desire of God under the heavens, and every desire from us, God's will regarding us, will also be time-bound. In other words, God cannot expect, if he's the perfectly just God I believe in, he cannot demand from us what we are incapable of achieving. And therefore, what's expected from us is not to somehow cough up with a universal good for all time ruling on planting, but whether this now is the best time to plant or to uproot the planting, to go to war, to make peace, and so on and so forth. Now that's the breakthrough. Okay, so suddenly the religious anxiety of achieving standards and norms which we are incapable of recognizing are brought down to earth. So the question now for Qohelet, the question of Yitaron in the eyes of God, morphs into how to do our humanly best in a situation. Okay, so the first stage in doing our humanly best is to make up our minds according, to our norms and standards, what is wrong and what needs to be put right, and what is the best way to do that. And he has a wonderful image, which is totally mistranslated. If you want to know what the advantage of the wise man over the foolish is, ma yitaron lachacham al haksil, think of a poor man going against life. Ma le'ani haholech neged hachayim. And to go against life from the point of view of a poor person is to realize that life has dealt you some bad cards, to articulate what's wrong with your life, to imagine ways of improving it, and go for it. Okay, so this is the first stage in being wise, taking an honest, critical view by means of your standards and norms as to what needs to be mended and to mend it. Okay, but he knows that we're locked into our perspectives. So the next stage is to argue that one needs to surround oneself with the critical opinions of people who disagree with you, who have different views. And there's something about that echo chamber of normative critique that allows you to create critical distance from yourself in ways you could never do by talking to yourself. Okay, this is very, very Talmudic. That within a dialogical setting, we're not going to arrive at the truth. I mean, one of us may surrender and say, I rest my case. I don't have any more arguments. But what such a dialogical setting allows you is to enrich and deepen and develop your position far better in the face of criticism than by talking to yourself. So this whole set of better this than that, better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of mirth, better to listen to the critique of wise people. By the way, a wise person is not someone who knows more than you, but someone who also invites your criticism, wise in Qohelet sense, then, better open yourself to or seek the rebuke of the wise than the praise of fools, and so on and so forth. And it's a very, very interesting chapter and very Talmudic in that sense. I mean, the Bavli fabricate it doesn't merely present, as in the Midrash, different takes on the Mishnah, but then sort of fabricates a very intense dialogue between these takes, which are usually people who could never have talked to each other, even if they're from the same generation, and fabricate a dialogue in which we're not aiming at consensus, we're not trying to reach agreement. It's certainly not a Socratic dialogue in which one wise guy is hitting everyone else over the head. No, it's a kind of parliamentary dialogue by which each position is developed, enjoys the challenge of a different, seriously committed to point of view, and ending up, most sugiyot of the Bavli end up with an array of positions which are, again, never adjudicated, but far, far richer and deepened. So this, I think, is the extent of human wisdom. And here, this is the final kind of argument for a social setting, because only within a social setting will you get diversity of opinion, which can be enjoyed in that way and viewed. It's a wonderful political argument. It's not about, to quote Rabbi Zaks, about the dignity of difference. It's about the value of difference. That's a different kettle of fish entirely. It's not about tolerating a diversity because we need each other, which is the position he started out from. But, thank God that we don't agree. So that's, chapter 7 is the high point of his philosophical argument. And then, by the time he gets to the end of the book, he's made his peace with death. And here I quote my father. I think he really hit that nail on the head, although I disagree with his overall reading of the book. But that last chapter, that description of the body gradually disintegrating, that description of going to our death peacefully. This doesn't cast a shadow on life like it did at the end of chapter 2. This is its natural completion. He's made his peace with it. Death is described as a golden sunset, and that's the image he uses. And never has been a more sort of relaxed poem of death. And that's where his argument culminates. So according to my reading, he poses himself the toughest religious problem possible, given his anthropology or anthropological epistemology. Goes on to a political philosophy, and from there to viewing criticism on diverse society as an asset, and finally describing the wise farmer hedging his bets by dividing his field humbly because he cannot know anything for certain. And that's Qohelet for you.
So let me jump in and ask then, because it's something we haven't covered in this grand sweeping reading of all the chapters together, which is, I would say quite an achievement. But something that isn't really covered or mentioned is the epilogue, right? So famously, the last half a dozen or so psukim of the book of Qohelet, the last of chapter 12, it seems to be out of place. And in fact, many, let's say in the academic world, the non-religious world, view this as an epilogue added in by a much later editor, which actually runs contrary to the main thrust of the book, because it speaks of Qohelet in the third person. It says, Qohelet did this, he did that, and then finally, the final sort of hammer blow of the book is famously the point, Sof davar kol nishma torim yurav et mitzvotav shemor, that at the end of the day, what is important is to fear God and to keep the commandments. Ki zeh kol ha'adam. This is the entirety of mankind, and many have read this as running very much contrary to the overall thrust of the book, because this does seem to pose a very sort of pious and conventional religious solution to the problem. Okay, all is hevel, so just be a good religious person as conventionally understood, let's say. So where does this epilogue fit into your reading, and how do you place it? Do you think this is of a piece with the rest of the book? And if so, how so?
Well, I'm not going to argue with the philologists. I mean, if there are philological arguments to the fact that the last 4 verses are an addition, a later addition, because of the third person, maybe because of the Hebrew, I won't argue with that. But what I shall argue is that the person responsible for those 4 verses understands Qohelet very, very well. It does not run counter. Because what happens in those 4 verses is the following. First of all, Divrei Chachamim kedorbanot kemasmerot netuim ba'alei asufot nitnu miro'eh echad. He suddenly describes wise people sitting in, teaching in gatherings. Sounds like a Beit Midrash, although this is long before Chazal. And what are they teaching? What has been given by the one shepherd? So first of all, as I said before, Qohelet's problem, or let me backtrack a second, Qohelet's problem similarly applies to understanding the world and making our judgments about the world and society, as much as it applies to understanding what God wants from us, to understanding Revelation, to understanding the rest of the Bible. I started out with the grand question, how can a monotheistic religious text ignore the rest of the Bible? And my answer to it is that this is a pre-revelatory deliberation. This is something that has to be worked out before you even open any of the other books. Why? Because until you've made your peace with the diversity of human reading in the eyes of God, you can't begin to deal with divine revelation, because, as I said before, different people will read and understand it differently. So those in favor of a sort of escape to Frumkeit, since we can't know anything for sure, since everything is hevel in the sense of emptiness, let's open the book, see what God commands us, and fear him and obey his command. How do you know what his command is? How can you ever vouch? I mean, this is a self-defeating argument. If all human understanding is meaningless, then what about our understanding of divine revelation? But Qohelet has now come, according to my reading, has come to a solution in which God accepts those diverse readings, and therefore he can end the book, or somebody who understands him very well can add on an ending to the book, describing the wise dealing with what they've received from, and again, Divrei Chachamim, Qohelet, wise people, wary of the limits of their understanding, of the differences between their understanding, arguing with each other, and so on and so forth. Applying this humanly diverse understanding and judgment to what they've received from the one shepherd. Okay? Now, by the way, that very verse in Bavli Chagiga, I think it's page 3b, is a midrash on that. Is that verse has made the basis for the Hillelite Manifesto. Okay, and we can talk about that maybe another time. But Chazal themselves, the Talmudic literature, actually read that verse as being about not merely wise people working out what God has commanded, but disagreeing radically regarding what halal metarim, halal metamim, and so on and so forth. And the poor student says, how do I study Torah if what the Torah I'm receiving is argumentative and diverse? And the answer is, make your ear like a hopper, take in all the opinions, and make your own decision. And thus for each generation. So that's the first one. Then it says that Elohim yirah mitzvotav shmor ki ze kol ha'adam. Now you have the license, not only the license, you have the obligation to work out for yourself what God commands us to do and what God wants us to do, and do it. And that's all man can aspire to. And then, of course, don't put it down in writing. Don't obligate the next generations by means of a book. You shouldn't be writing too many books. The only book worth writing is Qohelet himself, which is about not writing books, right? But, keeping this diversity open. So if you read those 3 verses the way I suggest, it's a perfect ending.
Interesting. And to your mind, is that why the rabbis decided to canonize this book? Because there are, within the rabbinic corpus of text, there are the remnants of arguments over whether or not Qohelet should in fact be part of the canon. There's a whole Mishnah Masechet Yadayim and Gemara elsewhere are very, that the rabbis sought initially to bury it or to sort of to marginalize it, to get rid of it. But eventually it was included in the canon. So to your mind, it wasn't included in the canon for this reason, that it serves as an example of a text encouraging the endless discussion and inclusion of a diversity of opinions, precisely because that is the way that human beings can overcome the problem of Hevel that faces them. Is that, do you think that contributed to the decision to canonize the book?
I do. I think the giveaway phrase is not about, look, the 2 arguments found in later rabbinic works, Amoraic rabbinic works, is that the people who decided not to canonize Qohelet believed that it spoke heresies, and in another version, because it contradicted itself. So we can assume that those who did want to canonize the book believed that it was free of heresy and didn't contradict itself. But that's not a sufficient reason for canonizing a work. The telephone directory is not heretic and doesn't contradict itself, but nobody would make it part of the Bible.
At best, it's an argument not to burn the book.
But the giveaway phrase is in Yadayim, which is much earlier than the other 2 famous sayings. And that's where the canonization of Qohelet is explicitly, not only explicitly presented as an issue between the Hillelites and the Shammaites, but ruled in favor of the Hillelites. And not only that, but on the very day that Elazar ben Azariah became president, that's the famous Hillelite moment when Yavne was taken over from Rabban Gamliel by the Hillelite leadership of Elazar ben Azariah and his rabbi Yoshua sort of hovering in the background. Now, the Mishnah could merely have said that there was a disagreement over Qohelet and, we ruled it in, but associating it explicitly with the Shammai Hillelite debate and attributing the decision to the very day in which Hillelite Talmudism was made the official kind of position at Yavne, is I think that's a very, very pregnant moment in terms of understanding Qohelet. It gives me the lens to do so. So, and to your very, very first question, I've dabbled with Qohelet over the years and published, I think, three papers on it, but never felt confident to present a full entire reading until I'd worked out my philosophy of rationality and normativity and diversity in general terms. Philosophy I called neo-Kantian pragmatism, and sort of finished the work I set out to do in a book called Rational Rabbis in 2019 with another book on the Talmud in which the Hillelite Shammite positions were worked out in full and fully generalized in terms of the Talmud's two great undertakings. And with that in hand, with the Talmudic lens to read the book on the one hand, and the philosophy of the transformative impact of dialogue and diversity and normative diversity in hand, I was able to go back to Qohelet and write this book, my part of the book, relatively quickly. There's an interesting development at the very, very end, in the afterword, where the other mystery of Qohelet, of course, its liturgical placing. Why is it read on Sukkot, on tabernacles? And the explanation I offer is that Tabernacle Sukkot is the one festival in which we leave our permanent homes and for dwelling for a week within these temporary booths, these temporary sukkot, and yet it's the most satisfying. It's the festival of joy. And I think Sukkot is a celebration of the recognition of our Hevel existence, that the precarious sukkah is really our real dwelling, and from within that dwelling, we can be satisfied with human achievement, meaningfully religious human achievement.
Right. The realization that we all live in a Dirat Arai, as it were.
Right.
Professor Fisch, this has been wonderful. I think this is probably all we have time for, unfortunately. But this has been a splendid journey from the beginning to the end of Qohelet, and to hear your reading and your consideration of the difficulties and opportunities within Qohelet. It has been quite wonderful. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence, and we hope to have you back at some point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Elisha Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Elisha Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.